Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about the history of feminism and the way that different schools of thought in feminism have developed in response to previous ones. So traditionally, feminism is considered to be divided up into three basic movements, which are called the waves of feminism. And the first wave, so feminist thought has been going on for a long time, but some of the earliest works that are thought to sort of mark the beginning of what we now think of as feminism started in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this first wave of feminism was largely focused on political and economic opportunities, focusing on bringing women some of the formal rights that they had been denied previously. So things like women's suffrage, property rights, access to education, reproductive rights, these kinds of things. Rights that are controlled by law and policy. So the first wave of feminism was largely about these sort of formal ways that women are oppressed. And then second wave feminism, which started, roughly around the 1940s and 50s. Simone de Beauvoir, the piece that you read from The Second Sex, that was considered sort of marking the beginning of second wave feminism. This wave was focused a little bit more on some of the more implicit social issues that affect women. So even though women had, for example, gained the right to vote, and certain sorts of economic progress had been made in terms of women's rights, the second wave feminism criticism was that just the formal rights of voting and access to education and those kinds of things, those are a great start, but that's all they are really. It's just a start. There are all sorts of implicit, informal social issues that affect women that need to be addressed. And so second wave feminism was largely focused on the liberation of women from oppression that was on a more social level. And second wave feminists argued that they need, although they had acquired some kinds of economic and political equality, that more was still needed. Things like marriage, motherhood, sexuality, sorts of social issues that appear at first to be very private and to be limited to the private sphere of the home, for example. Second wave feminists said, well, look, actually, those are really public, social, political issues, and they really deserve a lot of attention in the public sphere. So second wave feminism was largely a movement to sort of politicize and publicize the private ways in which women are oppressed, particularly in the home and in their social lives. So then third wave feminism, which is the most recent one, which started probably the 1980s and 90s, were maybe the 70s, was sort of a response to second wave feminism. And the basic criticism of third wave feminism towards second wave feminism was that though the issues that were focused on by second wave feminists were really important issues, they were really crucial and critical to liberating women from oppression, they tended to be overgeneralized with respect to which women are really affected by these issues. So the basic criticism of third wave feminism was that, look, women are actually a very, very diverse group. It may not even make sense to think about them as just one group, because women end up having all of these different sorts of social identities, and the ways that the different groups are carved up within the group of women is, according to race and class and socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. All of these identities end up affecting women and influencing the problems that face different groups of women in very different ways. And so third wave feminists like Bell Hooks, so you read that piece by Bell Hooks, women like her ended up criticizing second wave feminism for really not paying adequate attention to the differences and among women, among different groups of women, and the differences in the problems that they face, and therefore these women, these second wave feminists who third wave feminists criticized for having this oversight, ended up sort of making overgeneralizations about the forces of oppression that affect women. And so the third wave feminist critique is that, look, which largely came from women of color and women of non-heterosexual orientation, transgender women. These groups said, look, these problems that you're identifying in terms of the issues that face women and the forces of oppression are real, but they need to be thought about in a more critical way and in a more intersectional way. Because the ways that they affect, for example, women of color are incredibly different than the ways that they affect, for example, white women or upper middle class women. And so it was largely a movement, is still largely a movement of women of color and more marginalized groups of women responding to white middle class feminist ideas, particularly the ideas that pervaded second wave feminism. So one of the ways that this was done is to question whether, like I said, whether women as a group is really a productive identity to think about in feminism. That is it maybe going to make more sense to think about women as divided up into actually very specific groups according to these other intersectional identities that they have, because in a lot of cases, the ways that feminist issues affect women can be radically different according to these other identities that they have. So the issues that affect white women are incredibly different than the ones that affect women of color. The issues that affect cisgender women, that is non-transgender women, are very different than the ones that affect trans women. And so it may or may not end up making sense to think about women as a unified category like this. That's at least the argument of a lot of third wave feminists, and we're going to talk about that more. So this piece by Bell Hooks is so good, Black Women Shaping Feminist Theory. So this was largely written in response to second wave feminists like she mentions in her piece this book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And so Bell Hooks' piece here is largely in response to this kind of work, which was sort of a case study in the problems of second wave feminism. So Friedan wrote this book, The Feminine Mystique, which was very influential and a really important piece of writing in feminism. And it was sort of a description of the plight of women, as she called it, which largely made reference to upper middle class housewives. So she was sort of describing the plight of upper middle class housewives, which is that they were sort of forced to stay at home and be housewives and sort of led these unfulfilling and kind of idle lives. And so they suffered from a lack of opportunity to sort of express their own creative and personal professional endeavors. They were sort of forced to assume this role of the housewife that they may or may not have, wanted to assume. And so the third wave feminist response to this kind of work, particularly by Bell Hooks in this piece, was that, look, this is a real problem that Friedan is describing in The Feminist Mystique, this plight of the housewife, and that is a real way in which women are oppressed. But the way that she's presenting the problem is seems to be communicating the assumption that this is somehow the essential condition of women in America at that time, that this really sums up the ways that women are oppressed in the United States. And Bell Hooks says, well, no, that's a real problem and merits real attention, but let's be clear that that is a problem that affects a very specific group of women. So it deserves attention and care, but it is in no way representative of all or even most women in the United States. because these women who are housewives and are suffering in this particular housewifey way um, are women who are largely white, upper middle class, educated women who have the socioeconomic privilege of being able to be stay-at-home housewives, right? And so there's um, plenty of other groups of women who don't even have the opportunity to have that sort of problem, if you know what I mean. So they, women of color, poor women, trans women, etc. All these women are not being represented by this kind of work by Betty Friedan and other works like it. And so Bell Hook's piece was really a response to that kind of overgeneralized and sort of narrow-sighted sense of the problem of womanhood and the problem of women's oppression. So one really important thing that Bell Hooks mentions in her piece is that it's not that second wave feminism and the works that came out of that movement were necessarily deliberately trying to leave any particular groups of women out, or even that they didn't recognize that there were different groups of women who faced different problems. But there was this sort of, and there still is in a lot of strains of feminism, there's this attempt to sort of find the ways in which women's oppression is a unified phenomenon, and it's in the interest of solidarity, right? So a lot of feminists want to say, look, there is sort of an essential oppression of women that all women experience, and it unites us. And so Bell Hook's criticism of this is that, look, even if it comes from a good place, from a place of trying to show solidarity for other women and stand in a unified way, it ends up actually being harmful to a lot of women because it glosses over or erases some of the problems that face more marginalized women by assuming that all women's experiences are common. So while there may be some kinds of oppression that are common to several or even all groups of women, there may or may not, I'm not sure, but even if there is, by only focusing on the ways in which women are similar or the ways in which they're unified, we actually end up ignoring a lot of really important differences that that continue to marginalize groups at some of these intersectional identities. And so the attempts at solidarity of uniting feminism and uniting women's issues, in fact, works to sort of obscure really significant differences in ways that are really harmful to those women. So she also makes this really great point about comparing different types of suffering. So some people respond to third wave feminist critiques by saying, it may be the case that women face different issues and have different experiences, but that doesn't mean that we can say that one type of suffering is worse than another. This is what some people have said. They say, look, the plight of the housewife that Betty Friedan describes was a really serious problem. I mean, a lot of women ended up being really deeply emotionally oppressed and depressed by this experience and felt very unfulfilled and unhappy. And so some people say, well, how can you compare that to, the suffering of, poor women of color, right? So there are some poor women of color who end up, being happy and fulfilled even though they are oppressed in these various social ways. And then there are some, for example, white housewives who have all these privileges but don't feel fulfilled and are very unhappy. So some people have said, look, you really can't compare these kinds of suffering. And Bell Hook's response to that, which I think is really important to keep in mind, was that, look, it may be the case that that these women, these housewives, for example, that Friedan describes, are really, really suffering in a very profound way, and that shouldn't be ignored or discarded. However, we still have to be able to compare and evaluate different kinds of suffering in order to prioritize the ones that are really incredibly urgent life or death sorts of situations. So she says, there are certainly different kinds of suffering, but it's to say that you can't compare the kinds of suffering actually just sort of obscures and distracts from our ability to really be able to prioritize important goals. She says, look, these housewives, for example, are suffering in really profound ways, but there are other women whose literal physical safety is in danger, and their health is in danger. So to say that we can't really prioritize which kind of suffering deserves the most attention, she says that's not a good approach. That's not productive for feminism. We should be able to say, look, these are both problems, but look, women are dying over here. These women are really unhappy, but these women are literally dying. So we have to be able to focus on and be able to sort of prioritize goals in feminism, while still recognizing that there are all sorts of different kinds of suffering and different kinds of oppression. Because we need to be able to identify and respond to the most urgent situations. So the basic criticism and the basic philosophy behind third wave feminism, and a lot of the questions and problems that we're going to be talking about in this course are going to be sort of based on third wave criticisms. So the basic idea is that, look, women are really different. They have very different identities according to all sorts of other social forces like race and class and sexual identity and everything. That these women, that the whole of women is really carved up into these very specific groups. And those groups are affected by very, very different problems, particularly women who fall at the intersection of a lot of different identities. For example, a transgender woman of color who is uneducated and of low socioeconomic status. So that's an example of a woman who's at a lot of different intersections. And so those groups of women that have sort of the most intersectional identities end up being the most marginalized. And so women in those cases have very different feminist goals than, for example, upper middle class white women do. And that's really, really crucial to focus on in forming our own, versions of feminism. That the best way to show solidarity with other women, which is a good goal, it's a noble goal to show solidarity for other women, is not to assume that all women are the same or that we all experience the same sorts of oppression. Rather than doing that, the best way to show solidarity, according to third wave feminism, is to recognize and honor these group differences, and recognize that means that women of different groups are going to have very different needs, different interests, different experiences of oppression, and we want to refrain from assuming that what is true for one group of women is true for all women or is true for any other group of women. And so bell hooks and a lot of other third wave feminists want to say that's really what we should focus on if we want to show solidarity, is not to assume that women are all the same, but rather to start by assuming that different groups of women are going to have different experiences, and to let them decide what they need and let them evaluate their priorities, and then find ways for, if you're not a part of that group, find ways to help in ways that they deem important. And so that's going to be that's been the most recent and most common criticism of a lot of historical feminist texts and feminist movements. And so that's kind of a mindset that I want you all to keep in mind as we move forward through this course, is when we're reading pieces by feminists, particularly feminists before the 21st century, to keep in mind the ways in which their perspectives may be limited by their social identities, and to find ways to diversify the way that we think about feminist issues and feminist oppression.